Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolutely wild history of the American pharmacy. And to do that, we're actually going to use an incredible Smithsonian digitization project. They recently archived thousands of historic cosmetic and hygiene products, which perfectly bridges the gap between these bizarre old-world artifacts and the modern medicine and beauty industries we know today. Honestly, the history of how we get our medicine is just full of strange turns, massive egos, and some truly brilliant innovations. But before we even look at a timeline, consider this totally bizarre fact. Sphagnum moss was actually used to make surgical dressings and menstrual pads right after World War I. But it gets weirder. Centuries earlier, clumps of this exact same moss were found in 14th century barrels in Denmark. Why? Because it was used as toilet paper. It just goes to show you that human resourcefulness when it comes to personal hygiene and medicine, well, it spans centuries. So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with early American apothecaries, move into professionalizing the pharmacy, look at the rise of Kiehls, explore industrializing medicine and beauty, and finish up with the modern pharmacist. Section 1. Early American apothecaries, the Wild West of colonial medicine. Okay, so we're going to zoom in and out today, tracking the sweeping national history of the American pharmacy, but we'll also anchor it to the quirky micro-history of an enduring New York brand you might actually recognize. Kiehls. Back in the colonial era, European explorers were desperately cataloging New World botanicals. Things like cinchona mark from Peru, which was literally a massive breakthrough for treating malaria. But this sudden influx of new botanical knowledge, it collided head-on with a totally disorganized system of medical care back in the colonies. You see, in early America, an apothecary wasn't just handing you a neatly labeled pill bottle. No way. They were your doctor, your chemist, and a general merchant, all rolled into one. Out in rural areas, the local doctor was just mixing up their own remedies, often throwing completely unregulated, imported patent medicines into the mix. It was very much a chaotic do-it-yourself era. And this really highlights a huge divide in early America. The original 13 British colonies relied on this chaotic, completely unregulated system of hawking remedies. Literally anyone could sell whatever magic cure they wanted. Meanwhile, the Franco-Spanish territories down in New Orleans, they were actually much more advanced. They were implementing formal boundaries and even licensed the first North American pharmacist way back in 1769. Section 2. Professionalizing the pharmacy, bringing order to the chaos. So eventually, the public in the young U.S. desperately needed protecting from charlatans pushing toxic snake oil, lead, and arsenic. And the U.S. finally began standardizing the profession. This started with the Marshall Apothecary in 1729, which was an incredibly important shop that actually supplied the Revolutionary War. But the real game changer, that happens in 1821 with the founding of the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy. Pharmacists actually met at Carpenter's Hall, which, by the way, is the exact same place the Continental Association was signed, to draft a constitution-like framework for American pharmacy. They set strict ethical codes to expel anyone selling adulterated, dangerous drugs. Right at the center of this movement was a guy named William Proctor Jr. He graduated from that newly formed college and actually wrote the very first American pharmacy textbook. Whenever he went to international conferences, he aggressively championed what became known as the American way of pharmacy. Basically, this was the belief that the free market, coupled with really high educational standards, would naturally drive out the bad actors. We absolutely have to highlight these incredible female trailblazers too. While the whole industry was professionalizing, these women were breaking massive barriers to shape the modern pharmaceutical landscape. We're talking about women from Elizabeth Cooking Greenleaf in the colonial era, all the way to Julia Pearl Hughes, who was the first African-American female pharmacist to own and operate her own drugstore. They completely proved that this rapidly professionalizing field was definitely not just a boys' club. Section 3. The Rise of Kiehls, a micro-history in the East Village. Now, while the entire U.S. was busy standardizing pharmacy, a specific little corner in New York's East Village, which used to be the site of the famous Stuyvesant pear tree, was quietly building its own iconic legacy. This is the fascinating microhistory of 105 3rd Avenue. It started with a humble German immigrant named Louis Brunswick back in 1851 and later passed through the hands of dedicated apprentices like John Kiehl and then Irving Morse. What's really cool here is how the business stayed entirely in the hands of people who learned directly behind that very counter, all the way until it was eventually sold to L'Oreal in the year 2000. Now, Irving's son, Aaron Morse, completely revamped the brand in the 1960s, and he injected it with this massive, eccentric personality. The guy famously parked his vintage Harley-Davidsons right on the store floor just to entertain male customers. And get this, he used to ride around in a limo, delivering his famous blue Astringent with a pet chimp. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. He also practically invented that generous try-before-you-buy sampling culture that we see everywhere in cosmetics today. Section 4. Industrializing medicine and beauty. The shift to mass production. Because while Kiehl's was busy creating this quirky boutique experience, zooming back out, the dawn of the 20th century completely disrupted the traditional apothecary. The Industrial Revolution took hold, and suddenly, pharmacists were no longer in the back room hand-mixing secret formulas. Incredible mechanical advancements, things like the mass-produced tablet and the enteric-coated pill, both in 1884, completely turned pharmacists into dispensers of prefabricated medicines. Companies like Park, Davis & Company just started manufacturing on a massive scale. And of course, this massive shift in manufacturing necessitated a huge shift in the law. Enter the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, which finally gave the FDA regulatory oversight. This was a monumental milestone. Why? Because it legally acknowledged the incredibly dangerous line between medicine and makeup, a line involving toxic levels of things like lead and arsenic that had literally existed since antiquity. To tie our macro and micro stories together perfectly, think of the number 103. In 1979, the Smithsonian Institution featured exactly 103 Kiehl's products in their permanent archive. It essentially preserved this one wonderfully eccentric brand as a vital piece of American public health and industrial history. Section 5. The Modern Pharmacist. Bridging the Primary Care Gap. Let's look at where we are today. The U.S. is currently facing a looming shortage of up to 52,000 primary care physicians. That's a huge number. To combat this severe shortage, modern legislation is actually allowing pharmacists to step out from behind the counter again. Through things called collaborative practice agreements, or CPAs, pharmacists are now actively managing patient care, ordering lab tests, and even prescribing certain medications to manage ongoing disease states. If we look specifically at California's recent laws, your local pharmacist now has some incredibly advanced, life-saving capabilities at their disposal. We're talking about everything from furnishing the lock zone for opioid overdoses under Assembly Bill 1535, to providing hormonal contraceptives, and even interpreting complex lab tests. The pharmacist is really once again becoming a primary point of care, honestly very much like that original colonial apothecary, but this time armed with cutting-edge science. So we've seen pharmacists go from mixing totally unregulated snake oil on the colonial frontier to becoming industrial dispensers of mass-produced pills and now evolving into advanced frontline healthcare providers. Which really leaves us to wonder, as our medical needs rapidly evolve, what is the corner drugstore going to look like in another 100 years? Just think about how much has changed and how much the pharmacist's role will continue to adapt to our world. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope you found this visual journey as fascinating as I did.